Sometimes the oldest map isn't drawn on paper. Sometimes it eats weeds. On an overcast Tuesday morning in early October of 2018, the County Road Department parked its last bulldozer at the edge of a 40-acre tract outside Lawrence County, Tennessee, and admitted defeat. The machine had spent nearly 3 weeks pushing against walls of kudzu that seemed to grow back faster than steel could tear them apart. Herbicide crews had come before the bulldozers. Brush cutters had come before the herbicide. Volunteer crews had come before everyone else, swinging machetes through green vines that climbed trees, wrapped abandoned fences, buried stone walls, swallowed utility poles, and erased every shape the land had once remembered. None of it had worked. This was not a maintenance problem. It was gravity. Kudzu had lived on that hillside for so many decades that people no longer described the property by its owner or by its address. They simply called it the Green 40. Children riding the school bus looked through the windows at what appeared to be a rolling hill covered in one endless blanket of vines. Hunters walked around it instead of through it. Utility workers measured routes that avoided it whenever possible. Even the oldest farmers in the county could no longer agree on what the hillside had looked like before the vines arrived. Some insisted there had once been pasture there. Others remembered apple trees. A few believed an old family had lived somewhere beneath the green blanket, though nobody could point to where the house had stood or when it had disappeared. The stories had become local folklore, repeated often enough to survive, but never clearly enough to be proven. Then, 3 days after the county hauled away its equipment, a white pickup eased onto the gravel shoulder just after sunrise. A livestock trailer rattled quietly behind it, carrying 36 Spanish and Kiko crossbred goats that shifted patiently as the truck rolled to a stop. The driver climbed out wearing worn leather boots, faded denim, heavy work gloves tucked into her back pocket, and a tan canvas jacket stained by years of pasture work. Her name was Grace Whitmore. She was 29 years old, and unlike everyone else who had arrived with machines, maps, or chemical tanks, she carried nothing more complicated than portable fencing, freshwater troughs, mineral tubs, and enough patience to let hungry animals do what generations of people had forgotten they could do naturally. By 8 o'clock, the first goats stepped into the sea of vines without hesitation, rising onto their hind legs to strip leaves from stems nearly as thick as a man's wrist. A pair of county workers leaning against their truck laughed quietly, convinced the animals would disappear long before the plants did. Passing drivers slowed just enough to shake their heads before continuing toward town. Someone joked that the goats would need 100 years. Another wondered who would rescue them once they became trapped inside the vines themselves. Grace answered none of them. She simply watched the herd spread across the hillside with the calm attention of someone who believed the land was already beginning to speak, even if nobody else had learned how to listen. None of the people smiling beside the road noticed the small patch of stacked limestone that briefly appeared beneath the leaves before vanishing again under moving hoofs. Grace noticed it immediately, and without saying a single word, she reached into the cab of her truck, opened an old county plat map folded inside a weathered binder, and quietly traced one finger across a place where no building had officially existed for more than 70 years. Let me tell you about Kudzu because you cannot understand what Grace Whitmore believed unless you first understand what everyone else believed about the vine covering that hillside. Kudzu did not begin as the enemy. It arrived in the American South with good intentions. During the middle decades of the 20th century, farmers, conservation agencies, and agricultural programs planted millions of seedlings across worn-out hillsides because the plant grew quickly, anchored loose soil, slowed erosion, and covered land that heavy rains had stripped bare. For a while it appeared to be exactly what people had hoped for. Then the climate did what climate always does. It rewarded the species that could adapt the fastest. Long, humid summers, abundant rainfall, and mild winters transformed a useful ground cover into something entirely different. Mature vines could stretch nearly a foot in a single day during the peak growing season, climbing trees more than 60 feet tall, wrapping abandoned barns, pulling down old fences under their own weight, and forming green blankets so dense that sunlight could no longer reach the plants beneath them. The deeper problem was never what people could see above the ground. It was what remained hidden below it. Every season, the vines gathered energy through thousands of broad leaves that captured sunlight with remarkable efficiency, storing that energy inside massive underground root crowns that sometimes weighed hundreds of pounds. Even after crews cut every visible stem, those roots often survived, sending out new vines within weeks. Herbicides could weaken the plants, but successful treatment usually required repeated applications over several growing seasons. Bulldozers could scrape away surface growth, yet they disturbed the soil and frequently left enough living roots behind to begin the cycle again. Burning removed old vegetation but rarely destroyed the underground structures that made the plant so persistent. Lawrence County had spent years trying every accepted method. Annual maintenance budgets rose while visible progress remained frustratingly small. Contractors measured success in acres sprayed, miles cleared, and equipment hours completed, yet each spring the vines quietly reclaimed what winter had briefly surrendered. Residents gradually accepted that certain places would simply stay green forever. That acceptance became tradition, and tradition has a way of feeling permanent even when nature has other plans. Grace had spent enough years around grazing livestock to see the hillside through a completely different lens. Where most people saw an unstoppable invasive plant, she saw fresh forage available almost every day of the growing season. Goats are not built to graze the way cattle are. They are browsers. Their mouths naturally search upward for leaves, tender stems, young shoots, vines, shrubs, and brush that many other livestock ignore. Given enough animals, proper rotation, reliable fencing, and time for repeated browsing, they gradually force woody plants to spend more stored energy replacing lost growth than producing new roots. Each cycle weakens the plant a little further. It is not fast. It is not dramatic. It demands patience measured in seasons instead of afternoons. But Grace had watched neglected fence rows disappear under managed grazing before, and she knew something else that few people considered. When vines stopped hiding the ground, the land often began revealing stories no survey crew had expected to find. Standing quietly beside the portable fence that morning, she watched the first browsing paths spread across the hillside, and every few minutes another unfamiliar shape appeared beneath the leaves, disappearing almost as quickly as it had emerged, as though the land itself had decided it was finally ready to remember. Let me tell you about Grace Whitmore, because you need to understand the woman before you can understand why she never laughed when people called her ideas too slow. Grace was 29 years old in the fall of 2018, and she had spent nearly every season of her life on the same 180-acre family farm 5 miles west of Etheridge, Tennessee. Her grandfather, Thomas Whitmore, had purchased the original 80 acres in 1958 after returning from military service and working almost a decade at a hardwood mill to save enough money for a down payment. The farm was rocky, uneven, and far from the richest ground in Lawrence County, but Thomas believed good land was not something you inherited. It was something you improved one season at a time. He cleared fields by hand, rebuilt old fences instead of replacing them, planted trees that he knew he would never sit beneath, and raised cattle, chickens, and a small herd of goats that wandered through cedar thickets most people avoided. Grace's father, Daniel Whitmore, expanded the operation during the 1980s, adding another 100 acres and gradually shifting away from cattle toward rotational grazing after noticing that the steep hills recovered faster when the vegetation was managed instead of forced. Daniel kept careful notebooks inside a steel filing cabinet in the machine shed. Rainfall totals, pasture recovery dates, kidding seasons, mineral supplements, veterinary records, fencing layouts, and forage observations filled page after page in neat blue handwriting stretching back more than 30 years. Grace grew up reading those notebooks the way other children read adventure stories. She learned that every field had a memory, every season left evidence, and every mistake became useful only if someone bothered to write it down. When she left for the University of Tennessee to study animal science, many people assumed she would never return. Most graduates found work with feed companies, livestock nutrition firms, extension offices, or equipment manufacturers. Grace finished her degree, accepted an internship with a managed grazing research program, spent 2 years visiting farms across Kentucky, Tennessee, and northern Alabama, and came home anyway. She returned because she believed something her grandfather had repeated throughout her childhood. He used to say that machines remove what they touch, but animals teach the land how to heal itself. At the time, it sounded like the kind of sentence old farmers liked to repeat over coffee before sunrise. Years later, she realized it was less a proverb than a management philosophy. She became fascinated with targeted grazing, studying how different breeds browsed different plants, how stocking density changed feeding behavior, how recovery periods influenced vegetation, and how patient repetition often accomplished what expensive interventions could not. Her neighbors respected her work, but they also found it difficult to understand. She was willing to spend hours watching goats choose one plant over another, making notes about stem diameter, leaf preference, and seasonal growth patterns while others measured progress by how quickly a machine could finish a job. Grace never argued with them because she had inherited another Whitmore family belief. The land did not care who won the conversation. It only responded to whoever understood it better. That quiet conviction followed her every morning as she walked behind the browsing herd, recording small changes that nobody else noticed, until one afternoon the pattern of exposed limestone began matching lines she had already seen somewhere before. By the end of the second week, the hillside no longer looked the same. It did not look transformed, at least not to someone driving past on the county road. But Grace had learned long ago that real change rarely announced itself all at once. It appeared in small patterns first. One section of vines became thinner than another. A patch of sunlight reached the ground where none had reached before. Young shoots that had once covered the older stems disappeared almost as quickly as they emerged because the goats always returned to the most tender growth first. That was the principle many people misunderstood. Let me tell you about managed browsing because it was never about releasing animals and hoping for the best. Every afternoon, Grace adjusted temporary electric fencing by a few yards, controlling where the herd moved next. She measured forage height with a folding ruler, estimated leaf removal percentages in her notebook, checked mineral intake, and made certain the goats always had clean water before shifting them again. Overgrazing was as damaging as neglect. Underutilization allowed the vines to recover too quickly. The balance depended on observation rather than guesswork. County employees occasionally stopped to watch her work, although most still believed the project would eventually fail. One supervisor asked how long she expected 36 goats to accomplish what heavy machinery could not. Grace answered with a question instead. She asked how many new leaves a bulldozer removed after it left the property. The supervisor smiled politely, admitted that none did, and drove away without another word. Grace returned to her notebook. She had never believed machines were the enemy. They simply solved different problems. Machines removed vegetation. Animals changed plant behavior. Those were not the same thing. During the third week, the goats began concentrating along a gentle ridge running across the northern side of the property. Grace noticed they repeatedly browsed around several unusual openings where the vines refused to grow as densely as the surrounding hillside. Beneath those gaps, she found flat limestone surfaces worn smoother than ordinary field rock. They were too evenly spaced to be natural. She brushed away loose leaves with her boot and uncovered the squared edge of another stone less than 3 feet away. That evening, she unfolded the aging county plat map inside the tailgate of her truck. The paper had yellowed along its folds, and several corners had been repaired with clear tape years before she ever owned it. According to a survey completed in 1947, a narrow wagon lane had once crossed the property before disappearing near a structure identified only by a small black rectangle and the handwritten initials HC. No road reached that point today. No building appeared on satellite imagery. Modern tax records listed nothing except undeveloped woodland. Grace compared the map with the limestone she had uncovered and quietly noticed that the alignment matched almost perfectly. The next morning, she arrived before sunrise carrying measuring tape, small marking flags, and a simple compass that had belonged to her grandfather. She was not looking for treasure. She was looking for confirmation. As the first light spread across the hillside, the goats resumed feeding exactly where they had stopped the evening before, slowly revealing another straight line of carefully stacked limestone extending farther than any natural rock formation should have. Grace knelt beside the newly exposed stones, placed her hand across their weathered surface, and realized she was no longer following the goats. The goats were leading her somewhere that the county had forgotten decades earlier. The first people to stop laughing were not historians or county officials. They were farmers. Farmers notice patterns because their livelihoods depend on recognizing small changes before they become expensive ones. By the fourth week, trucks began slowing along the county road every morning, and instead of shaking their heads, drivers stepped out to watch the hillside quietly. The green blanket that had hidden every contour for decades was beginning to break apart into patches, exposing stretches of earth that had not seen direct sunlight in generations. Grace continued her routine without changing its pace. She moved portable fencing, checked every animal for sound hooves and healthy body condition, refilled mineral feeders, and entered fresh observations into the same notebook she had carried since graduate school. She understood that curiosity could become distraction if she allowed excitement to replace discipline. Let me tell you why she refused to rush. Every successful targeted grazing project depended on consistency rather than speed. When goats repeatedly removed fresh leaves, the vines responded by drawing stored carbohydrates from their underground root crowns to produce replacement growth. Each new flush required additional energy. When that new growth was browsed again before it could fully replenish the root reserves through photosynthesis, the underground storage gradually declined. The process resembled withdrawing money from a savings account without making new deposits. One withdrawal changed little. Repeated withdrawals over time eventually emptied the reserve. That was why Grace rotated the herd carefully instead of allowing the animals to remain in one location indefinitely. She wanted the vines to spend energy recovering while preventing them from rebuilding their strength. It was a biological process rather than a mechanical one, and biology always followed its own schedule. During one afternoon inspection, Grace noticed that the goats repeatedly avoided walking across a narrow strip of ground where the vegetation had become noticeably thinner. Animals often sense changes in footing long before people did. Curious, she knelt beside the exposed limestone and gently cleared away loose leaves with a small hand rake she kept in the truck. Another carefully shaped stone appeared beside the first, then another, each resting with remarkable precision. They were not scattered naturally across the hillside. They had been placed there by human hands many decades earlier. Grace measured the distance between the stones and compared it with the dimensions marked on the aging plat map. The numbers aligned so closely that coincidence became increasingly unlikely. She photographed every newly exposed section before covering nothing and disturbing nothing, believing that observation should always come before interpretation. 2 days later, after another controlled rotation, the goats opened a wider corridor through the remaining vines. Sunlight reached the ground long enough to reveal what looked unmistakably like the corner of a stacked limestone foundation extending beneath the surrounding vegetation. Grace remained silent as she studied it from several angles. She had learned from her father that the quickest way to lose credibility was to announce a conclusion before gathering enough evidence to support it. Instead, she marked the location with a small survey flag, recorded the compass bearing, and quietly added one sentence to her notebook. If this alignment continues another 30 feet, the hillside may be revealing the footprint of something much larger than anyone in the county still remembers. By the beginning of November, the hillside had started changing in ways that no one could dismiss as coincidence. What had once looked like a single wall of green now revealed narrow corridors of open ground weaving between clusters of stubborn vines that had not yet been browsed. Each morning Grace walked those corridors before releasing the herd into its next grazing cell, carrying only her notebook, a measuring tape, and the small compass that had belonged to her grandfather. She was no longer searching for isolated stones. She was beginning to see a pattern. The stacked limestone extended farther with every passing week, forming straight lines that intersected at angles nature almost never produced. One line ran east to west for nearly 40 feet before turning sharply toward the south. Another appeared several yards away, nearly parallel to the first. Between them lay a level stretch of ground that remained unusually firm even after several days of autumn rain. Grace crouched beside the exposed foundation and brushed away a thin layer of damp leaves. The stones had been shaped by hand, their faces remarkably flat despite decades beneath vines and soil. Whoever built this place had not gathered random rocks from a nearby creek. They had carefully selected, fitted, and leveled each block with the patience of people expecting the structure to outlive them. As the goats continued browsing nearby, additional details slowly emerged. Rusted sections of hand-forged fence wire surfaced beneath the retreating vegetation. A line of moss-covered fieldstones stretched toward what appeared to be an old gateway. Several mature cedar trees stood in an almost perfect row, suggesting they had once bordered a lane rather than growing there by chance. Grace compared every new discovery with the faded county plat map resting on the hood of her truck. The measurements matched closely enough that she finally telephoned the county property records office and requested copies of survey documents predating the 1950s. The clerk promised to search the archives, but warned that many older records had never been digitized. Grace thanked her and returned to the hillside without disappointment. She had already learned that the land often preserved history more faithfully than paperwork. Over the following days, curiosity spread quietly through the community. Neighbors who had once questioned the project now arrived carrying old family photographs, hand-drawn maps, and stories passed down from grandparents who had spoken of a farm somewhere beyond the vines. Most remembered only fragments. One recalled an orchard. Another mentioned a springhouse. An elderly resident believed there had once been a large front porch facing the morning sun, although he admitted he had never actually seen it himself. Grace listened carefully but treated every memory as a clue rather than a conclusion. She knew that stories became less precise with every generation, while stone rarely exaggerated. Late one cool afternoon, after the herd had finished another carefully managed rotation, sunlight reached a section of ground that had remained hidden since the project began. There, only a few feet beyond the exposed foundation, rested the circular outline of carefully stacked limestone descending into darkness. Grace walked closer, stopped at the edge, and looked down into what could only have been an old hand-dug well, still standing exactly where someone had built it more than a century earlier, waiting beneath the vines for the day the hillside finally decided to give back another piece of its forgotten past. The county survey crew arrived on a cool Monday morning, carrying measuring wheels, laser levels, and stacks of aging property records that had not been opened in decades. Grace greeted them politely before stepping aside. She had never wanted to prove herself right. She wanted the land to be understood correctly. As the surveyors stretched bright orange tape across the exposed limestone, they quickly realized that the foundation extended much farther than anyone had expected. The rectangular footprint measured nearly 38 feet by 26 feet, dimensions that matched a substantial farmhouse rather than a simple hunting cabin or storage shed. Nearby, the old hand-dug well stood almost perfectly centered between the foundation and what appeared to have once been a kitchen garden. A narrow stone walkway gradually emerged beneath the thinning vines, leading toward the remains of an entrance where two weathered limestone blocks still marked the location of a front gate. Every day, the goats continued browsing the remaining patches of vegetation with the same steady rhythm that had begun this entire discovery. They did not understand they were uncovering history. They simply followed their natural instincts, selecting fresh leaves before moving methodically toward the next section of growth. Grace often smiled at that thought. Nature rarely cared about recognition. It simply kept doing what it had evolved to do. By Wednesday afternoon, one of the county archivists returned with copies of handwritten tax rolls from the late 1800s and several faded survey plats preserved inside protective sleeves. The name attached to the property surprised everyone standing around the folding table beside Grace's truck. According to the records, the hillside had once belonged to the Harper family, who established a working farm there shortly after the Civil War. The documents listed a farmhouse, smokehouse, springhouse, orchard, livestock barn, and nearly 25 acres of cultivated fields. The final entry appeared in 1919. After that year, the records became unusually brief, eventually identifying the parcel only as unimproved land. No explanation accompanied the change. No disaster was recorded. No formal demolition appeared in the files. It was as though the farm had quietly slipped out of memory, while the landscape slowly reclaimed every visible sign that people had ever lived there. News of the discovery spread through Lawrence County faster than anyone expected. Local historical society members visited the site carrying old photographs donated by longtime residents. One faded black and white image showed a family standing in front of a white farmhouse with a wide porch supported by 4 square wooden columns. Behind them stood two enormous oak trees positioned exactly where mature stumps still rested beneath the retreating vines. Another photograph revealed a split-rail fence running beside a lane that matched the line Grace had first noticed weeks earlier. Suddenly, the scattered clues no longer stood alone. The stones, the well, the lane, the cedar row, and the forgotten records all belonged to the same story. Yet one detail still puzzled everyone involved. The photographs showed several outbuildings surrounding the farmhouse, but only one foundation had been uncovered. Standing near the old well as the afternoon sun settled behind the hills, Grace unfolded the newest survey map beside the original plat she had carried since the first day. One small symbol on the southern edge of the property caught her attention. About 100 yards beyond the exposed house site, hidden beneath the last untouched section of dense vines, another small rectangle appeared beside the handwritten word springhouse. Grace quietly folded the maps together, looked toward the remaining wall of green, and realized the hillside had not finished telling its story. Over the next several weeks, the remaining vines on the southern slope gradually disappeared under the same careful grazing rotation that had uncovered the farmhouse foundation. Grace resisted every suggestion to speed up the process with heavy equipment. She knew that rushing now could damage features that had survived beneath the vegetation for generations. Instead, the portable fencing continued moving a little farther each day, allowing the goats to remove fresh growth while leaving the soil largely undisturbed. The method demanded patience, but patience had already revealed more than anyone believed was still hidden beneath the hillside. One cold November morning, sunlight reached a shallow depression near the natural spring marked on the old survey. As the last curtain of vines fell away, a low limestone structure emerged from the hillside almost exactly where the 19th century plat map had placed it. The roof had long since collapsed, yet three stone walls remained remarkably intact, their carefully fitted blocks still holding firm after more than 100 years. A narrow channel lined with flat limestone slabs carried clear spring water toward what had once been a cooling basin. The county historian smiled before anyone else spoke. The springhouse had been built to keep milk, butter, fresh vegetables, and cured meats cool long before rural electricity reached that part of Tennessee. Nearby, additional discoveries followed almost naturally. The outline of an orchard appeared where uneven rows of aging apple trees still survived beneath decades of unchecked growth. Several rusted iron hinges rested beside the remains of what had likely been a smokehouse. Fragments of handmade bricks surfaced near the foundation, along with pieces of blue and white stoneware that local preservation volunteers carefully documented without removing from the site. Every newly exposed feature matched another forgotten detail inside the archived records, confirming that the old Harper farm had not vanished suddenly. It had simply been abandoned, reclaimed by nature one growing season at a time until memory itself became overgrown. As county officials assembled the evidence, another discovery quietly reshaped the story. Property records revealed that the Harper family had never sold the land after leaving. Through decades of inheritance, changing surnames, and forgotten legal transfers, ownership had eventually become impossible to trace without modern archival research. The hillside had remained largely untouched because nobody realized exactly what had once existed there. What began as a vegetation management project had unexpectedly restored an entire chapter of local history. Reporters from nearby towns visited to document the unusual recovery, but Grace declined every attempt to portray herself as the hero. During one interview, she simply explained that the goats had done what goats naturally do, and the land had responded the way healthy land often does when given enough time. She reminded people that the real lesson was not about discovering old buildings. It was about paying attention before assuming that abandoned places no longer held value. As autumn faded toward winter, volunteers placed temporary markers around the exposed foundations while preservation specialists discussed the possibility of documenting the entire site for future historical study. Standing quietly near the restored springhouse, Grace watched the herd browsing the final patches of lingering vines farther down the slope. Beyond them, one last section of uneven ground remained partially concealed beneath scattered vegetation. And although the survey maps showed nothing unusual there, the shape of the earth suggested that the hillside might still be holding one final surprise that no document had ever recorded. Winter arrived quietly across Lawrence County, and with the first hard frost, the last remaining curtain of Kudzu turned brown, exposing a hillside that looked nothing like the place people had driven past for decades. The farmhouse foundation, the hand-dug well, the springhouse, the stone walkway, the orchard, and the old lane now formed a complete landscape instead of scattered discoveries. County officials partnered with the local historical society to document every visible feature before beginning any preservation work, and university researchers visited to compare the uncovered structures with settlement records from the late 19th century. Their conclusion was remarkably consistent. Very few abandoned farmsteads had survived beneath invasive vegetation, with so many original features still intact. The vines that had hidden the property for generations had also protected much of it from development, erosion caused by heavy machinery, and careless disturbance. During one final inspection before winter grazing ended, Grace walked toward the uneven rise that had continued to draw her attention. The goats had already removed nearly every remaining patch of vegetation, leaving only dormant grasses across the slope. Near the crest, a cluster of limestone markers emerged from the ground in a gentle arc. Each stone weathered until its inscriptions had almost disappeared beneath a century of rain and changing seasons. The county historian carefully brushed away loose soil, using only soft brushes and clean water. As faint lettering slowly became visible, several names matched those recorded in the Harper family tax records discovered weeks earlier. It was not a forgotten cemetery in the dramatic sense that many people might imagine. It was a small family burial ground, common on rural farms throughout the 19th century, resting peacefully on the highest point of the property where generations had once looked across their fields every morning. The discovery completed the story the land had been revealing one careful layer at a time. The hillside had never truly forgotten the people who built it. It had simply waited for someone patient enough to uncover its memory without destroying the evidence along the way. By the following spring, Lawrence County approved a long-term conservation agreement that protected the historic site while allowing carefully managed grazing to continue as part of the property's vegetation plan. Educational field days brought students, farmers, historians, and conservation specialists together to study both the ecological benefits of targeted browsing and the importance of preserving rural heritage. Grace rarely stood at the center of those gatherings. More often, she answered questions beside the pasture fence while the goats quietly browsed nearby, exactly as they always had. Visitors frequently thanked her for uncovering a forgotten chapter of local history, but she always offered the same gentle correction. She explained that history had never been lost. People had simply stopped seeing it beneath the vines. Before leaving each afternoon, she often paused near the old stone well and looked across the restored hillside, where sunlight once again reached every foundation, every orchard row, and every pathway built by hands more than a century earlier. Her grandfather had been right all along. Machines could remove what stood in front of them, but patient stewardship allowed the land to remember what it had always carried beneath the surface. Sometimes the greatest discoveries are not created by forcing nature to surrender its secrets. They appear when people finally learn to work with nature instead of against it, giving the land enough time to tell its own story.